Imagine taking a highly polished PowerPoint presentation from like a high-level United Nations summit. You know, the exact, I mean,
Absolutely. The
yeah.
ones filled with sleek, color-coded graphs.
Right. Color-coded graphs, synergy buzzwords, bullet points mapping out global salvation, all of that.
Yeah, very clean, very
Yeah,
corporate.
exactly. Now, I want you to imagine taking that exact presentation, but forcing it to play through a cracked microphone on a stubborn acoustic guitar in some smoky basement cafe.
Wow. That sounds, well, incredibly dissonant. I mean, you're taking the ultimate language of sterile top-down bureaucracy,
Yeah.
and you're just shoving it into the most raw, grassroots musical format we have.
And that tension, that exact dissonance, is what we are exploring today on this deep dive.
It's a fascinating contrast.
It really is. We've got this massive stack of conceptual documents, creator liner notes, and thematic track lists in front of us for a project called SDG Blues, 17 Songs for Earth 2026.
Which is quite a title.
Right. Now, look, if you are listening right now and rolling your eyes thinking a folk album about UN policy, that sounds like the most tedious, preachy thing imaginable, you are definitely not alone.
No, not at all.
I mean, I had the exact same thought when I first opened these files. It sounds like, you know, a cringe-inducing marketing stunt.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Well, it does until you look at the architecture of what the creator is actually doing here.
Yeah, we're not just reviewing an album today. We are unpacking the philosophical and emotional weight of this project because it's asking a really profound question about modern civilization.
Right. It's asking, what happens when global policy language is forced to sing like wounded 1960s folk music?
And to even understand the weight of that question, we kind of have to look at the acronym driving this entire thing, which is the SDGs.
Yes. The UN Sustainable Development Goals. For anyone who, doesn't spend their free time reading international policy frameworks.
Which is most of us, honestly.
Exactly. These are 17 global objectives established by the United Nations. They cover poverty, hunger, climate change, inequality.
Basically a comprehensive to-do list to solve humanity's most massive collective failures.
Right. And pay attention to how those goals are usually presented to you and me in the real world.
Yeah.
You see them as neatly numbered aspirations on polished museum plaques.
Or as little colorful squares on a multinational corporation's social responsibility webpage.
Yes. They are entirely sanitized.
Yeah.
The language is designed to sound actionable, optimistic, and above all, clean.
Clean is definitely the operative word there, and this album project takes those 17 sterile goals and violently smashes them into the tradition of the 1960s protest folk movement.
Which historically is the exact opposite of clean.
For sure. I mean, think about the folk singers in Greenwich Village or the Appalachian labor activists. They confronted war, systemic racism, corporate corruption, and they did it using simple chords and direct emotional truth.
It was acoustic. It was intimate.
Deeply personal.
And that brings us to the devastating inside joke of this entire album. The creator's liner notes make this fascinating point. Humanity didn't create these 17 sustainability goals because we were feeling particularly ambitious or visionary.
Oh, right. We created them because we collectively realized civilization is simultaneously drifting towards 17 different catastrophes at once.
Exactly. The album treats the SDGs not as hopeful corporate slogans, but as a glaring, deeply embarrassing indictment of global failure.
Okay, but let me stop you there and just push back on the premise itself for a second. The liner notes call this folk music for a civilization trying to hold itself together with sustainability reports.
Hey, that's a great line.
It is, but isn't it inherently absurd to mix something as dry as a sustainability report with the raw emotion of a protest song?
Well, yeah.
I mean, does the album want us to laugh at the bureaucratic absurdity or cry at the planetary crisis? Because it feels like those two reactions sort of cancel each other out.
I'd actually argue that the tension between laughing and crying is the entire point. The absurdity is intentional.
Okay.
The liner notes describe these as protest songs written after the protest signs became PowerPoint slides.
Oh, wow. That paints a picture.
Right. The aesthetic here is profoundly compassionate, but deeply cynical. The project smiles through broken teeth. It takes these dry statistics like, say, the percentage of people lacking basic sanitation, and it turns them into ghosts that haunt the listener.
Turning statistics into ghosts. That is a brilliant way to look at the first act of this project, because when you look at how the album translates basic human survival metrics into intimate poetry, it essentially builds this, well, this architecture of human need.
Yes.
It takes these massive, invisible global systems and just shrinks them down to the size of everyday objects.
We see that immediately in the opening track, which corresponds to SDG1, which is no poverty. The song is called The Common Floor.
And notice how it entirely avoids all macroeconomic jargon. Poverty isn't framed as an economic threshold or, a gap in GDP.
Right, it's framed as architecture. The song imagines society as this towering building with locked elevators and invisible owners.
And the floor becomes this powerful dual metaphor. It's the literal ground beneath us, but it's also the minimum dignity we refuse to give each other.
That's beautifully put. It takes a systemic failure and makes it a physical, claustrophobic space that you are trapped inside.
Because you can't emotionally process a statistic about the global poverty line, right?
Yeah.
But you can absolutely feel the claustrophobia of a locked elevator.
Exactly. And that personalization of the systemic, it carries right into the second track, which addresses SDG2, Zero Hunger. It's titled The Common Table.
Shrinking the global food supply chain down to just a single dining room.
Right. By doing that, the song makes the concept of a meal entirely political.
I found the imagery described in the notes for The Common Table so awkward and striking. Abundance and starvation sitting at the exact same table, just pretending not to notice one another.
Yeah, it's visceral.
Yeah.
It forces the listener to realize that hunger isn't a logistical problem about growing enough food. It's a cruelty problem about unequal distribution.
Which naturally bleeds into the way we treat human health. SDG 3, good health and well-being, becomes track 03, The Common Breath.
The translation from policy to poetry here is amazing. It strips away all the pharmaceutical empires and hospital billing codes.
It just leaves you with the fundamental biological act of breathing.
Yes. The notes describe it as a blues hymn for fragile lungs and overworked nurses.
It highlights the strange modern privilege of being allowed to survive only if you can afford it. Calling it the common breath asks a terrifyingly simple question, Why does inhaling have a price tag?
Exactly. And then how do we teach the next generation to navigate that kind of world? That's where the album tackles SDG 4, quality education.
Right. Track 04 is called The Open Gate. And again, there is no mention of literacy rates or standardized testing.
No, education is portrayed as a guarded border crossing.
The lyrical imagery in the notes for this one is incredibly moving. It describes how some kids arrive at this gate carrying books, while others arrive carrying history itself on their backs.
Man, carrying history on your back is such a quintessential folk music concept. It takes generational trauma and gives it a physical weight.
Yeah.
And we see a similar, really knife-edge critique in the way the album handles gender equality. SDG 5, that's track 05, No More Lace.
No More Lace. I mean, it sounds like the title of a 100-year-old Appalachian ballad.
It does. The creator notes actually call it the prettiest title on the record, but they warn that it hides one of the sharpest knives.
How so?
Well, lace becomes a symbol for every decorative expectation placed upon women. It represents the delicate, intricate ways society distracts from the fact that actual power remains quietly hidden elsewhere.
Usually in the hands of men.
Precisely.
So it's a razor-sharp critique of modern patriarchy, but it's disguised as a gentle acoustic song.
Yes, and wrapping up these baseline human needs is SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. The album calls this track 06, the iron handle.
Like the iron handle of a faucet.
Right. The song treats water as a sacred infrastructure. It focuses on that invisible miracle of turning a handle and expecting civilization to just effortlessly appear.
Which we totally take for granted. We only ever notice the iron handle when the water stops flowing.
Exactly. Which forces the listener to confront how incredibly fragile the baseline of our survival really is.
And that fragility is just a perfect bridge into the next major thematic movement of the album.
Yeah, the transition is seamless.
Because once our basic needs are laid bare, the project shifts its gaze to the exhausting machinery that is supposed to provide those needs in the first place. The industry, the labor, the cities, the gears of civilization.
Right. Take SDG 7, affordable and clean energy. The album translates this into track 07, the turning sail.
It totally bypasses any debate about solar panels or wind turbines, doesn't it?
It does. Instead, it repurposes an old maritime folk image. The sail, wind, motion, and labor.
The song poses a much deeper philosophical question than just energy policy. It asks, can humanity actually change direction before our momentum becomes our destiny?
Wow. Yeah, it's sung about the sheer inertia of human habits.
And those habits are deeply tied to how we work. Which brings us to track '08, More Than Numbers, tackling SDG 8, decent work and economic growth.
This one is so relatable. The liner notes explicitly state this song pushes back against the reduction of workers into productivity graphs.
There is this phrase used in the concept document, the hidden exhaustion of quarterly applause.
Oh, that phrase captures the corporate condition perfectly.
Doesn't it?
Every spreadsheet contains human exhaustion hidden inside its cells. The song rejects the sterile corporate language of human resources and demands we recognize the tired, breathing people behind the data points.
It really makes me wonder, are we as a society just trying to hold ourselves together with caffeine and sustainability reports rather than actually fixing the machine that's burning us out?
Yeah.
We applaud a quarter of record growth, but we just completely ignore the burnout it took to get there.
And consider how that machine dictates our physical reality. SDG 9 covers industry, innovation, and infrastructure. The album calls this track '09 the common path. It looks at roads, wires, and bridges.
But it treats them as dividing lines just as much as connective tissue, right?
Exactly. The profound idea the creator explores here is that innovation is never neutral. A new road or a new piece of technology always decides who gets carried forward and who gets left standing in the dust.
And wealth flows along those very paths, which the album maps beautifully in track 10, The River Runs.
That's SDG 10, Reduced Inequalities.
Right, because a river ignores human borders, but it remembers contamination. The song follows wealth downstream, watching how entire nations are forced to drink from very different economic currents.
Which is such a powerful image. Then we hit the urban landscape in track 11, The Elm and the Iron, for SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities.
The creator paints nature and industry as these exhausted old rivals here.
Yes. I love the visual of the elm tree surviving in the cracks between concrete sidewalks while steel towers cast permanent shadows over our memory of what used to be there.
It feels incredibly weary, like the city itself just wants to go to sleep.
It's the sound of modern emotional fatigue. And that fatigue culminates in track 12, The Clear Shell, for SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production.
The track confronts the terrifying reality that everything disposable eventually becomes geological. Plastic, packaging, our entire convenience culture.
Right. The shell represents consumerism, but it's also a metaphor for the fragile earth trapped inside of it.
Which brings us to a huge pivot. Because if the machine of civilization is burning us out and burying us in plastic shells, what is it doing to the planet itself?
Yeah, this takes us into the final thematic arc of the project, the fragile earth and whatever hope we have left to govern ourselves.
Starting with track 13, the salt tide, which represents SDG 13, climate action. Honestly, listening to the conceptual description of this track, it feels like sitting in a sinking rowboat while the people in charge are having a highly intellectual, polite debate about the theoretical properties of water.
That is exactly the vibe. The notes literally refer to it as the storm song, but it's a quiet storm.
The waterline rises steadily while politicians continue speaking in the future tense.
Right, debating policy in boardrooms. It frames climate change not as a sudden cinematic apocalypse, but as a slow, daily betrayal by the people supposed to be steering the ship.
A slow, daily betrayal that hits so much harder than a doom and gloom Hollywood scenario.
It really does. And then we have track 14, Let It Be Clear, for SDG 14, Life Below Water. The title alone sounds like a 1960s peace and love anthem. Let it be clear.
But the irony is sharp, because it's staring directly into poisoned oceans.
Yes, the lyricism focuses on how the sea remembers every chemical confession humanity has poured into it. It weaponizes that idealistic folk language against our own environmental sins.
Which forces the realization in track 15, Root and Bone, covering SDG 15, Life on Land. The realization that we were never standing above nature, managing it like a resource.
You were standing inside it the entire time.
Right. If the roots and bones are poisoned, so are we.
And this systemic reckoning forces us to look at how we govern ourselves. SDG 16 is peace, justice, and strong institutions. The album interprets this as track 16, The Living Pulse.
It demystifies the idea of the system.
Exactly. The song frames democracy as a heartbeat, pointing out that institutions aren't monolithic villains or magical saviors. They are fragile machines built by flawed hands, and we've too often abandoned them to rust.
That imagery of rusty institutions brings us to the final track. SDG 17 is Partnerships for the Goals. The album closes with track 17, One Hand Holds Another.
And the creator's notes are very specific here. This track refuses easy optimism.
There is no victory parade.
No.
Yep.
There's no triumphant choir singing that we saved the world. Cooperation is framed as humanity's last remaining technology.
It's not about winning, it's about contact. It ends with the simple, desperate act of holding on to someone else in the dark.
Yeah, that's powerful.
It really is. And this brings up the overarching aesthetic of the entire project, which the liner notes refer to as post-optimistic.
The visual and emotional symbolism is incredibly specific throughout. You got cracked acoustic guitars, faded LP sleeves, protest signs gathering dust, smoke-filled cafes.
The lyrical textures are all rivers, roots, rust, concrete, wind, wires, and salt.
It creates an atmosphere of extreme weariness, climate anxiety, massive economic inequality, total institutional distrust. These are the things shaping the emotional atmosphere of the music.
It perfectly mirrors the modern emotional fatigue you likely feel every time you look at the news. The album exists somewhere between a campfire and a collapse.
Yes, between a bureaucratic policy document and a funeral hymn.
Let me ask you the million-dollar question, though, because the notes mention that the old protest singers of the 60s, they actually believed their songs could embarrass the powerful into behaving like human beings. And the album asks if they were naive or if they were the last sane people in the room. In a world of systemic failure, where we need 17 global emergency goals just to survive, does a tuned guitar actually matter?
That's the core question, isn't it?
Yeah. Is folk music just a fragile, useless human tool against enormous corporate and political systems?
Well, I would argue it's the only tool that preserves our humanity.
How so?
Art, especially this kind of politically charged, deeply intimate folk music, it translates the overwhelming scale of global collapse into something you can actually hold in your hands.
That makes sense.
You cannot emotionally process a 500-page United Nations climate report.
Yeah.
It's too big, it's too abstract, your brain just shuts down.
Right, you just glaze over.
But you can process the image of a rising salt tide or a common table where one person starves while another feasts.
So it bridges the gap between the global scope of the crisis and the intimate feeling of actually living through it.
Precisely. It gives us a way to mourn our failures, but also a way to recognize each other. The fact that the tape keeps rolling, that the guitar stays tuned despite the overwhelming odds, it means we haven't entirely given up the act of bearing witness.
To bring all these conceptual threads together, SDG Blues is not an album about sustainability. That bureaucratic word is way too small for what this project actually represents.
Way too small.
It's an exploration of the terrifying reality that humanity requires a color-coded emergency framework just to behave decently toward one another and the earth.
The joke is brutal, really. We are failing in 17 different directions simultaneously.
Yeah. It peels back the polished museum plaques and the corporate synergy to remind us that underneath all the bureaucracy, there are just tired people trying to figure out how to share an incredibly fragile world.
Well said.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. Think about how history remembers civilizations. The empires of the past aren't remembered for their administrative paperwork, right? They are remembered for their art, their tragedies, and the humanity they left behind.
So true.
What if the real legacy of our current era won't be the polished policy documents, the corporate sustainability frameworks, or the exabytes of data points we saved in the cloud?
Yeah, what if when archaeologists dig us up thousands of years from now, they learn who we really were, not from the 72 UN Sustainable Development Goals, but from the crack in the acoustic guitar that tried to sing them? That is something to think about.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.